Welcome to Echoes in the Gallery. I am your host, Susan L. Sistrunk. Tonight, we begin the second volume of the series, Between the Lines. During these episodes, be sure to pay attention to the clues provided within the dialogue. Remember, as we learned at the end of Volume 1, absolutely nothing is what it seems, and no one should be trusted. Pay attention to the characters. There are no good people, just those who make better bad decisions than others. Let us step into the gallery and begin. Echoes in the Gallery, Volume 2, Between the Lines. Chapter 1, A Trail of Breadcrumbs. Cold, damp air filled Victoria's nostrils. The scent of decay rising from wooden planks beneath her cheek made her cough awake, staring into the darkness. This time, the punishment hadn't been as tough. The man had become angry and for some reason stopped after the first blow to her head. It had been hard, though. He then screamed at her about how he thought the plot should proceed from where it was. It was obvious he was unhappy about the thought of Rachel escaping into the desert. He saw that as a horrible event, given her transgressions against Jonathan and the other characters. Oh boy. A psychopath with a sense of morality. Victoria started to laugh, and the emotion quickly turned to tears. She sobbed in the darkness, laying on the floor of some unknown location. It could be anywhere. Victoria was also hungry. The man liked to withhold food when he was displeased. With the tiny rations he already gave her, Victoria could feel her strength fading, and she needed to get strong. Until now, the primary focus had been on how to strong-arm or force her way out of the situation she was in. Now, with the cold, moldy air enveloping her small frame and the pain in her stomach increasing, Victoria realized the strategy needed to change. There was no way out of the chain around her ankle unless the man released her. She must find a way to make his demeanor change and make him want to give her positive reinforcement for the story. Without a clock, and having lost consciousness for an unknown amount of time in the pitch-dark room, she felt certain the man was waiting for her to wake up and begin screaming and begging to be released again. It was time for a new strategy. He obviously loved the story. All of her stories. Maybe she could use that. Lifting up her body in the void darkness, Victoria called out softly, "Hello? I'm ready to listen. I can help make your characters come to life." She knew he was listening. He was always listening. There was no doubt he heard her and probably had a camera in a vent somewhere. There were too many times he had walked in while Victoria had been tugging at the chain. "I can do what you want, but I must have food. Real food." The door opened and he towered above her. "Why should I give you anything when you do not fulfill my wishes?" "I'm weak from not enough food and being cold all the time. If I'm not in good health, there is no way for me to adequately concentrate on what it is I need to do." She pleaded with her eyes, hoping she was making it through to him. If Victoria could just soften this man up a little, she knew it was possible to somehow get out of the situation. Without a word, the man turned and left. Her eyes filled with tears that silently flowed down her cheeks. Victoria began to think other thoughts of ending it. Surely there was a way to get that accomplished. She sat in the dark and began contemplating on how to close out her life when suddenly the lights turned on. A sigh left her body. A few moments later, the door opened. The man carried a tray with a sandwich, soup, and a cup of steaming tea. "I will feed you better from now on as long as you produce good work." The heat should be coming on as well. Victoria could feel the temperature slowly change and heat come in through the vent. The man laid another blanket on the bed. "In the morning, I expect you to get back to work and not disappoint me again." He turned and shut the door. Victoria looked down at the food. It wouldn't be poisoned. There would be no point to that. His sudden change in care led Victoria to believe she was on the right track. She now had the upper hand. She just needed to keep it that way. As she slowly drank the soup from the mug, Victoria began to form a plan. Detective Salvador pulled into the driveway of a small house in Murfreesboro, Arkansas. He doubted there was much to this, but something was gnawing at him. The car that had been stolen had never been out of Arkansas. It belonged to an elderly lady named Eugenia Granbury. So the man who harassed Victoria at the bookstore had stolen a car from Arkansas to drive to Texas with the sole purpose of harassing an author? The car had been recovered before the disappearance, and no DNA had been recovered. But he had an idea. Just a thought. The house Salvador had parked at belonged to the chief of police, who was expecting him. After sitting down at the kitchen table with a couple mugs of coffee, Sheriff Burnett looked at Detective Salvador with a thoughtful stare. I doubt very seriously you drove all the way here from Texas just because of some boosted car and a cup of my bad coffee. So what can I do for you? Salvador laughed and held his cup up in admiration. A man who gets to the point. I like that. He pulled out a photo from the folder he brought in with him from the car. That woman is named Victoria Graham. She disappeared 29 days ago outside of Austin without a single witness or clue. She is gone. The kind of gone that makes me think she could be dead, and I should be looking for a body instead of a person who is still alive. But I just have this feeling, and I can't let go. Sheriff Burnett looked at Detective Salvador with determination and curiosity. I'm not telling you anything you don't know when I say the odds of finding this woman are almost zilch, right? I mean, she's been gone for a damn month. And what does the car have to do with it? Salvador pulled out a picture of the stolen car taken from the security camera in front of the bookstore the night Victoria was harassed, and explained the circumstances of that evening. Now I know this is a pretty common car, but Victoria Graham disappeared 2 days after this picture was taken, where a man harassed her and then drove off in a car that was registered here and reported as stolen. Now my question is this. Were any stolen cars dumped in this area around the time this one was picked off here and driven to Texas? Well, not in Murfreesboro, but I see where you're going with this. I guess it would be easier to track it this way than any other stolen cars around Austin. Let's see what we can dig up. You don't think she's in Texas anymore, right? Honestly, I think we've been chasing a red herring looking in Texas. I believe the kidnapper left the state with her as soon as he overpowered her. Sheriff Burnett nodded thoughtfully. It was starting to make sense. Let me do some digging. I will ask other counties and see what we can find out. He paused and looked down at his coffee cup. What are the odds this woman is still alive? Salvador looked down at his coffee cup and sighed before looking at Sheriff Burnett. You know, that's interesting. Usually, after someone is gone this long, I would say less than 5% chance. But there is something about the way her agent described this guy who's probably responsible. He seemed like he was in love with Victoria, like he idolized her. Turns out he wrote her several times using a remailing service. Salvador reached into his bag and pulled out some letters. Sheriff Burnett began sifting through the typewritten pages. Typewriter, huh? Old school. Bet you a $2 bill it's a Royal. My mother used to have one. The paper is even vintage onion skin. Heck, where would you even buy that now? Exactly. So I did some digging on the paper. There are a bunch of places that sell this type of vintage onion skin paper on eBay, but this particular brand has a watermark. Salvador pointed to the center of the paper. It read permanized in cursive. Stacked beneath that word was Plover Bond 25% cotton fiber. That narrowed the search down quite a bit. I only found 2 suppliers on eBay, and one of them sold about 5,000 pages of it last year. The buyer paid with a credit card that turned out to be fraudulent under the name Eric Crane. The address listed for shipment was a P.O. box. Guess where it was located? Sheriff Burnett met Salvador's gaze. I'm going to take a shot in the dark and say Murfreesboro, Arkansas. Bingo. Now, I don't think our guy is necessarily from here, but it might be a stopping off point for him. I want to access the security camera footage from the post office. Since I have no jurisdiction here, some help from you would be greatly appreciated. Salvador looked at Burnett with anticipation. Sometimes other jurisdictions would help out state sheriffs, and sometimes they felt it a nuisance or an intrusion. I'd be happy to get that for you if I can. Shouldn't be an issue, really. Nice folks down there, and I know they would want to help out. Salvador felt relief wash over his entire body. He felt certain that this mystery man who had abducted Victoria couldn't be located more than a day's drive from the post office. An hour later, the two were at the post office looking through security footage. There was a considerable amount of time to go through, but they focused on the time period when the car had been stolen. They had the photograph from the parking lot where Victoria had been harassed with her agent for comparison. After scrolling for a while, and Salvador thinking he was just on completely the wrong track, there it was. He pulled out the photo from his pocket for reference. When he unfolded the piece of paper and put it alongside the screen time stamped at 1:58 p.m., just an hour before the car was stolen, Sheriff Burnett gasped audibly. That can't be right. You must be mistaken. This man couldn't be who you're looking for. Where did you say you got this photograph? At a bookstore in Texas. He approached Miss Graham the night of her book signing there. Why? Do you know this person? Salvador stood up straight and looked at the sheriff with anticipation. He knew he had been right to follow up with the car. The sheriff's face was white and looked like the wind had been knocked out of his body. Sheriff Burnett slid down into his chair and put his head in his hands. Sobs began to wave through his body uncontrollably. The unmistakable sobs of grief. After a few minutes, he collected himself and sat up, tears still streaming down his face, with the sobbing at bay. I'm telling you, this is impossible. The man in that photograph is my son Daniel, and he's been dead for 10 years. This concludes Episode 1, Trail of Breadcrumbs, in Volume 2. What did you think? I am always interested to hear feedback. Remember, paid subscribers to my podcast receive exclusive content weekly from me about the writing process, inspiration, and more. Echoes in the Gallery continues to be available on Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever you get your podcasts. Join me, your host, Susan L. Sistrunk, next week for Episode 2 of Volume 2, A Slippery Slope. Until then, thank you for listening. Stay safe and love each other.